First, though, news reporting sometimes has to share information that's so shocking, so disgusting, that it's barely comprehensible. The facts are sickening and it raises some testing considerations for media.
Young lives tragically cut short in the most horrific way. A burnt shell of the family car towed, all that remains of the confronting scene which shattered a peaceful Brisbane suburb. Rowan Baxter was sitting in the passenger seat. It's believed he stabbed himself while his children were alight. Their mother Hannah leapt from the car screaming, "He's poured petrol on me." She was taken to hospital in a critical condition where she died last night. Another life taken by an unspeakable crime.
At a time when we've had a long-running national discussion about domestic or family violence, threats to partners and children, and the problems especially with violent men, this terrible episode lifted the issue to an even more gut-wrenching level, a cruelty beyond compare. The Daily Telegraph's front page called it what it was, "You low mongrel." And as the Courier Mail declared, united in grief, we declare domestic violence to be unacceptable, always. We must listen, we must believe, and we must help. There are no excuses. Yes, it should hardly need saying, of course, no one would suggest it's acceptable, but it's no surprise this atrocity would lead media to double down on this issue. Some media refused to describe the murderer as a father or husband. Others made a point of being careful with names. ABC journalist Chelsea Hetherington tweeted, "Police say that Hannah Baxter's family have requested for her to be referred to as Hannah Clark. It's also her legal name. Let's all keep that in mind and pay Hannah and her family the respect they deserve." Fair enough, these are small things, but they are important. It's about thinking of victims, not their monstrous murderer. Debate arose over other issues, such as this news.com.au headline, "Good night, my babies, Camp Hill car fire dads," Facebook posts leading up to horror. It prompted Executive Director of Change.org, Sally Rudd, to tweet, "Why is this headline a quote from the alleged murderer? Why are you centring on him as a loving father?" News.com Editor-in-Chief Kate De Brito quickly responded, "Sally, I rarely jump on Twitter as it's full of willful misunderstandings. News.com.au has written many stories about this tragedy, not a single one sympathetic to this man. We're as appalled as the rest of Australia. Focus your anger in the right place." Among those joining Rugg's criticism was Radio National journalist Matt Bevan. "The whole article is gross," he tweeted. "We don't need to know what this guy posted on his Facebook page. He doesn't need a voice." Well, look, people were angry. Most of us still are. But this sort of Twitter sniping from journalists is unedifying and misses the mark. This monster was not given a voice. It's not up to Bevan to decide what is revealed from Facebook about this bloke and what is not. He was not portrayed as a loving father. Rather, this stuff from the past is chilling and informative. Readers would have recoiled, certainly I did, at the very thought of this bloke playing up the family niceties while harbouring the anger and evil we now know was at his core. Horrible as this stuff is to see and read, the media's job is to inform us, not to shield us. And it can be important when we come to know what to look for, how to prevent such crimes. It shows us how evil can be disguised, or perhaps that there will be clues as well. The most intense debate centred on a press conference that was held by the then lead police investigator, Detective Inspector Mark Thompson.
To put it bluntly, there are probably people out there in the community that are deciding which side, so to speak, to take in this investigation. Is this an issue of a woman suffering significant domestic violence and her and her children perishing at the hands of the husband, or is this an instance of a husband being driven too far by issues that he's suffered by certain circumstances into committing acts of this form?
Driven too far. The reaction was swift. As you might have seen, I immediately raised questions about these comments on the Kenny report just minutes after they were uttered. It seemed obvious these words were ill-judged. In fact, the thought processes were hard to comprehend, and it was going to prompt a strong reaction. Sure enough, ABC journalist Sarah Geraghty tweeted, "When will police stop doing this?" A woman and her kids murdered by a violent partner, and yet again cops talk about how he may have been driven too far. It's victim blaming and excuse making for a killer. And from news.com.au journalist Marnie O'Neill, she tried to get help from police. Now we know they were just another obstacle. This is what she was up against. Making it about her again, Egyptian-American activist Mona Ottaway tweeted to her controversial remarks on ABC's Q&A last year. When I asked, how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping women on Australian TV, there was more outrage at hypothetical violence versus men than actual violence versus women. Australian man killed his wife and 3 kids by setting them on fire, and police looking to excuse him. Well, that's overstating what was said, but still, as is the way these days, the social media pile-on led to immediate action. The officer was bumped from the case.
As I was suggesting and asking him that he needed to step aside, he actually volunteered and said for the integrity and the confidence of not only this investigation, but us in policing, he needed to.
Now, some defended the police officer, and to be fair, not only was he in the middle of an horrific case on day one, but he had attempted to explain his comments later in the press conference. The Courier Mail's chief crime reporter, Kate Kirikou, noted how the officer's context that we're keeping an open mind is a common one. Police can't zone in on one line of inquiry. They would come a cropper in court, or in this case with the coroner, if they did. They do need to look at the complete picture and consider all factors. Surprisingly, perhaps, The Guardian's Amanda Mead agreed. I watched Thompson's press conference live and thought he was an exemplary spokesman, she tweeted. Very sensitive and skilled at saying what he thought and what he could in the circumstances. It was in the context of community perceptions. And on ABC Radio in Brisbane, Loretta Ryan also was sympathetic.
But all he wanted to really say was he needs to get evidence before the coroner.
Yeah, totally understand, and understand that he would be gutted, and it is a lot of pressure that police are under when they do have to confront the media and answer questions and make an explanation. So, you know, I'm sure hopefully people can understand that pressure as well.
Look, it's not hard to see how people would have sympathy for Detective Inspector Thompson. Who among us would want to deal with what he was confronted with on that day? But what he said did sound like victim blaming. It did suggest that a man could be driven to commit such unspeakable evil. Evil is evil, violence is violence, and language is powerful. He should have said he'd examine all aspects of the history, look for trigger points, threats and disputes from both sides of the relationship. But it's beyond the pale to countenance that someone could be driven too far so that their response is setting their family on fire. If this is difficult for people to understand, then our police officers need to sit down and discuss these issues more deeply. And if this is a case of muddled mistakes in front of the cameras, the words coming out all wrong, then perhaps better media training would be a pretty good idea.